Okay, it is recording. Again, there is a Q&A option. If you can submit questions there, and we'll try to get to them at the end of the program. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us tonight. My name is Laura Cole, and I am the Academic and Public Engagement Coordinator for the Daura Museum of Art. This program is being offered in conjunction with our current exhibitions, Forced to Flee and Peter Turnley, Photojournalist. Your registration confirmation email should have included links to virtual versions of these exhibits. And I hope that if you're able, you'll be able to stop by the museum to see them in person as well. They are on view through November 20th. So I'd like to extend my thanks to Jay Profit in the Teaching and Learning Center for helping us get this panel organized from a technological standpoint, and of course to our wonderful panelists for speaking tonight and for their help in planning this program. And so to introduce our panelists, Dr. Ghislaine Lewis, Cindy Ferguson, and Dr. Lindsay Michie. Dr. Sabina Mannion was on the schedule for this evening as well. Unfortunately, she is unable to join us tonight, and so I'm very grateful to Dr. Michie for stepping up to join us on such short notice. We're very glad that you're here with us. So Dr. Ghislaine L. Lewis is an assistant professor of communication studies and co-chair of Africana Studies at the University of Lynchburg. Dr. Lewis's love of travel and passion for the classroom have taken her on adventures around the globe. Her academic work and experiences in Asia, New Zealand, Australia, Africa, and the Caribbean and the United States have provided valuable insight into the linkages between new media, global politics, and policy. Her current research interests are focused on the role of the media in fostering an active and engaged public sphere. Cindy Ferguson was a first-generation student beginning her course of study at CVCC at the age of 40. She received her associate's degree from CVCC in 2011, her BA in psychology from Randolph College in 2013, and her master's of education in school counseling from Lynchburg College in 2016. While working on her master's of education, she was the first graduate assistant for the Bonner program, learning more about not simply serving in the Lynchburg community, as she has done since moving to the area in '91, but focusing on how to tackle root causes and making systemic changes. After being a school counselor for a couple of years, she returned to the university as the interim director of the Bonner Leader program to help them transition to a 4-year program. And last April, Cindy became the director of what is now the Center for Community Engagement. The mission of the CCE is to connect, inspire, educate, and empower both our campus and our community as they transform lives. They connect all faculty, staff, and students to serve in our community on a continuum from volunteerism through community-based research. Dr. Lindsay Michie is a professor of history at the University of Lynchburg. She teaches courses on African and South African history and on music and revolution and art and revolution. She is the author of 3 books, including The End of Apartheid in South Africa and Sounds of Resistance, The Role of Music in Multicultural Activism. She has studied, taught, and worked as a as a freelance photojournalist in the UK and in South Africa, and worked for a few years in the Urgent Action Office of Amnesty International. And so without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. I will be asking a question and allowing a few minutes for each of our panelists to answer before moving on to the next question. Our first one, I'll be sharing my screen for, and if you have not already seen the exhibits, fair warning that there are some graphic images included. So I'm going to share my screen. And if we can all see it, Ghislaine, we'll start with you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about these photographs. So I am incredibly pleased to talk about this because photojournalism is definitely one of my passions. If you guys know me on campus, I almost always have a camera with me. I think for journalists, for good journalists, for artists, especially for Peter Turnley, it's all about giving voice to the voiceless. And I think he definitely does this with his photographs. And Laura, I'm just going to ask you to skip ahead to the Somalia photo. So when I went to see the exhibit at the museum, this was one of the photos that first resonated with me. I think for me, this reminded me so much of the vulture and the girl photo. I don't know if you guys know that photo by Kevin Carter from 1993. It won a Pulitzer Prize. So it's the photo of the vulture um, sitting waiting for a starving child. It's one of these iconic photos if you're into this type of photography. And even though this photo is taken a year before, you see that trauma of the crisis in Somalia stretches an incredible period of time. And for me, this photo of the mom holding her baby while it appears touching a um, either really ill or sick man definitely brings back those traumatic images from that Kevin Carter photo from 1993. What I will also say, as a child of the Caribbean, the joy and the trauma that I see in the photos from Haiti. Laura, can you skip back for me, please? So these photos from Haiti look at the trauma that is happening when you've got political instability. Having grown up in the Caribbean, having grown up in places where there's been a lot of incredible violence, I think this photo of the woman walking down the street while there's a dead man lying in the streets um, definitely brings back memories of some situations I've been in during my childhood. And then if we skip to the next one, um, you see the what I'm assuming is an American soldier juxtaposed with Haitians in the streets of Haiti, and I think what this photo for me symbolizes is the fact that for so many people, you know, this just becomes a way of life. For us, these images can be really bracing, but for so many people, this is what my life looks like every day. What I will say is that in the museum, these four photos that I'm going to talk about coming from the Caribbean are side by side. And so you've got these two images with the trauma in Haiti juxtaposed by two images with what I can assume is some of the joy and the faith that comes out of, or that can be seen even in the midst of trauma. So I spent some time in Cuba a few years ago, and I absolutely understand the poverty that some Cubans live in. But even when things are, I think with this photo with these boys playing in the streets, it shows that even when things are at their lowest, there's always a reason to smile. And obviously this is from Turnley's newer work. I think the virtual exhibit says that he's working on a book on life in Cuba. And so this is from the more recent stuff, but you could definitely see the joy in these kids, and then juxtaposed with the faith that we see in the following photo. And so I think this is emblematic of life in the Caribbean. Even when things are at their worst, there's always a reason for joy. What I will say is the exhibit, when you think about the photos, the trauma, the joy, the beautiful stories that the quilts tell, you juxtapose those with the narratives that you hear every day about immigrants, right? In the US, at last count, I think the 2018 was the last count, there are about, let me get my numbers right, there are 44 million immigrants, right? So 44 million immigrants based on the 2018 stats that I have. And of those 44 million immigrants in 2018, they accepted 22,000 refugees. And that same year, they granted 38,000 asylum claims. And that's just a drop in the bucket for, you know, the number of people who are living with refugee status around the world. And so I think these photos definitely help to humanize how we think about what's a refugee and what's an immigrant, especially thinking about some of the narratives we've heard over the past few years. I think I will stop there. I feel like I went on a lot.
That is great. And before we move on, I realized you knew what question was coming, but for
my bad.
everyone else, the question we're looking at right now is, how did the images and the works from the exhibits bring you to reflect on the current refugee crisis and immigration narratives in the United States? So thank you, Ghislaine. And we will move on now to Cindy.
Muted?
Yeah, Cindy, you might be muted.
Sorry. Could we start with the wanted home image? For me, when I think about, as soon as I walked into the exhibit, it really brought a lot of perspective about this week, even because on our campus this week, we have Hunger and Homelessness Week. And what does that look like for us right now? What does that look like all over the world? And when we think about homelessness and moving someone from homelessness to home ownership, what does that look like? What does that look like, not just here, but around the world? So when I saw this image, that really made me think about where we are right now. And there's so many people that are displaced all around the world. Like it says on here, over 65 million people were displaced by conflict and persecution at the end of 2016. So when we think about that from perspective of United States too, we really, U.S. citizens really have no clue what the rest of the world is going through. We do research, we try to make ourselves aware, but we really don't have that experience, most of us, and what that looks like. So my perspectives too have a lot to do with service. And the ways that we serve, the ways that we see humanity, and bring everyone together. So, and to remember, one of the pieces that I looked at too said to remember that they are us. There should not be a us and them, that we're all a part of this humanity together. So would you move to that first one again? These are quilts. In the first part of the exhibit too. So when I looked at this too, the refuge offer sanctuary or discard as trash, you know, how do the people in the United States really view people that we help? How do we help each other? You know, how do we make a difference in our world? And our world is not just here in Lynchburg and not just on our campus, but in our state and our nation. And these are global crises, and how are we going to be a part of solving some of those issues? And the way that we look at each other, you know, do we look at each other that we provide a sanctuary for people and we welcome people in, or do we just discard them? So those things are all, you know, very important to how we look at our world. What is our own worldview? If you'll move into the life jacket one, the life jacket graveyard in Las Vegas. When I think about this makes me think about the ways that we give to those around us. One of the things that I was reading about this too is that so many people that die that have drowned and have been in these life jackets, and these life jackets really are not protective for them. I mean, one of the things that it says right here is that these life jackets are fake and they're filled with sponges. So when we give in our community and around the world too, do we give our best or do we give what we discard? So for us to really think about that in humanity, would we want something that somebody just discarded, or would we want something that is somebody else's best, that we know that they've sacrificed for us, and we know that that we have sacrificed for somebody else too, and that to bring us all together to that place, how important that is for all of us. And then the last piece that I wanted to show was this one, because I don't know how many of you have ever experienced foot washing, but there's so much that goes into that. In this piece too, where this young woman washes the feet of her grandmother in this refugee camp. But as we really think about, as we wash the feet of someone else, how much humility is there too. You know, how do we view each other in this place? And are we both humble as we seek to get to know each other and to see each other as human beings as well? Pope John Paul says that no one is so poor that he has nothing to give, or nobody is so rich that they have nothing to receive. So when I think about a photo like this too, I think about, you know, what am I willing to give and what am I willing to receive? No matter where I am, how educated I am I always willing to learn from somebody else? Am I always willing to give to somebody else as well? And I think that's the attitude or the narrative that I would hope that we would have in the United States as we look at each other, not just in the world that we see in front of us, but the global world that's around us. How do we reach out? How do we solve the problems of this world in a way that brings humanity all in one place? So I think that's where I want to stop for now too.
All right. And Dr. Michie, we will move on to you.
Okay. Thank you all for inviting me. And I apologize again. This was short notice for me, so I may not be as eloquent as Ghislaine and Cindy, but I'll do my best. Looking at the photos and the artwork in this exhibition, I was really struck by the beauty in all of these pieces and how the beauty doesn't take away from the tragedy of a lot of these stories portrayed, but sort of makes them more poignant and more intense. And they're personal in a way that it makes it harder to look away from these different stories. It's harder to ignore them. And I think this is good because we live in an age of constant distraction, you know, and short attention span. And so these images make us kind of linger on the stories and the narratives. And so, for example, this work by Maya Schonenberger, Armenian Diaspora, what I was particularly taken with, besides the artwork, which is sort of has a kind of never-ending travel sort of theme to it, was the quote, "Even if my eyes cannot see you anymore, my heart always will." And it's sort of an expression of preserving those images in our minds, you know, and it's sort of, as she says, a kind of universal message of immigration and of exile in a way, is that you leave someplace behind, and people behind, but you stay connected, and then we stay connected to these people that are, you know, having to make these enormous changes in their lives. They're ordinary people like us. I think that's one of the most important things to remember about immigrants. They're just us. And so through these images, we feel their humanity. So if you want to go to the next image. So there are a lot of these photographs and pieces of art I noticed involve children. And I think that's a way that, you know, particularly even in the stories that are coming out recently in our own news about immigration in this country, a lot of the, you know, the narratives involve children that I think can particularly make us stop and think about it a little bit because of, you know, how we feel about children. Everyone has humanity, but there's a particular sort of poignancy to this happening to children. And in this piece, Will the Next Day Be Better by Gabriela Di Tota, she's incorporated pictures that children have drawn. These are Syrian refugee children. And it's sort of like an ordinary child draws pictures. I mean, that's what they do in their daily life. But their daily life isn't normal. And so the pictures they're drawing, when she puts them together, sort of like, you know, will the next day be better? And the pictures they're drawing aren't necessarily always happy pictures. So I think this is another example of personalizing the experience. And I think that's really important when we're thinking about immigration, because we often hear about immigrants and refugees in numerical terms, in terms of numbers. And I think in a way that's often to manipulate our own concentration on the issue, so that we think in terms of, oh, that's way too many, you know, or that's way too much. And we've forgotten that these are people like us. And I've noticed also in recent years that a lot of the reporting and narrative about immigrants in our country they kind of blur the line between undocumented workers and refugees, you know, as if that all is they're all in one category. And this means that there's a way of criminalizing everybody who's coming from overseas in one way or another, and focusing that criminal label on those, especially those coming from poorer countries, or those coming from Africa, or those coming from Latin America. And so I think that, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a minute. I think that it's very important to bring that personal element back to the story, and that's what these images do. So for example, this next image, I chose this one like Cindy, because there's something so personal about it. And it reminded me, I was doing this exact thing for my mother just about a week ago. I was doing this because she had injured herself and so she couldn't move as well. And so it's a kind of universal experience that makes you more connected to people. And also in the midst of this kind of difficult situation, it's a sweet moment. You can see by the expression on both of their faces that it's something that means something to them, you know, in the midst of everything else that they're going through. And then in the last photo, this photo is very, of course, poignant. Peter Turnley's photo of the famine crisis in Somalia. And these are photos of children, but the expressions on their faces are people much older. You know, they've been through something already. They're like adults who've seen and experienced too much already. And I think, again, this is an image you can't just turn away from, you know, or be very hard to. And even if you did, it's still going to stay in your mind. And so I think it's very important to have images and artwork like this to, you know, force you to think about this issue in terms of humanity, in terms of people. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next question. I'm going to stop presenting. And so we'll just go in the same order. Question number 2, what are our responsibilities on our campus, in Lynchburg, statewide, nationally, and globally as it relates to these issues?
So I think the first thing we have to think about is, how are we embracing international students on our campus? How are we embracing DACA recipients on our campus? How are we embracing refugees on our campus? I know that our numbers are small, but when students come to our community, are we making them feel welcome, or are they being othered, right? I think so much of our narrative is always focused on they're bringing these students in, or not necessarily our narrative, but so much of the campus narrative is focused on bringing the students in to fill diversity and inclusion quotas. And that's not necessarily the way these students see their place in our community, right? They understand probably a lot more than you that you understand the value of education, right? And what this education means for their family, whether they come from well-to-do families or whether they come from families suffering from poverty. Either way, education is going to be the foundation. And so how it is we craft the narratives with these students in our classrooms, because I think that becomes incredibly important. I think sometimes you see a brown student or you see a Black student and you automatically put them into an American category when that's not necessarily where they fit. So are we taking the time to listen to the stories? Are we taking the time to listen to the stories of our students? What I will say on our campus is that we also have a lot of students who are first generation. And so they might not be international students, but they're definitely first generation Americans. And for many of them, that immigrant mentality remains because that's the way their parents raised them, right? And so we have to be very careful with the narratives that we're espousing on our campus. I think in the community, some of those same ideas remain. I think, living in Lynchburg, especially as an immigrant, sometimes can be a very isolating experience. And so how is it that we're embracing immigrants, refugees, DACA recipients in our community without making them feel that they're filling a quota system? I think it's very important that we educate ourselves. I think, as Lindsay said, there are a lot of numbers and there are a lot of narratives that don't necessarily paint immigrants in the best light. But I think if you listen to these people's stories, if you listen to their overcomer stories, I think you'd understand that they, have a place in the community just as much as you do. I think when you think about nationally and statewide, we always have to think about how it is that we are using our influence for good. And so even if we might not hold statewide office, what are we doing to elevate or amplify voices in our community? Who are we advocating for? How are we advocating for those people? And I think you never know how these small acts of kindness can absolutely change a family or a student's life. Sorry, Laura. On to Cindy.
Oh, that's good.
As I thought about this question, it made me really think about what are the policies that we have in place, and what is the capital that we have here to be able to help those around us. On our campus, I think about students that are both international students and those that have immigrated to this area in our community that may be commuters even. And what are the resources that we actually have here, not just on our campus, but our Lynchburg community, to be able to help. And as I researched a lot of these things in our area, I know that, for example, we had Bonners that used to help with an ESL program just up the street from us, but that program doesn't exist anymore. And there are a lot of, or actually we are lacking a lot of resources in our community. And it really is about bringing people together to help those in our community as well, both on campus and the greater Lynchburg community. Who do we reach out to? Not just about the knowledge of what resources are available, but to have conversation and to build relationships with people that, just like Ghislaine just said, that we need to have conversations, that we need to hear people's stories. Those stories are so important about who they are and who we are and who we become together. So those conversations are so important and those relationships are so important. When we think about our city and our state and our nation, what are the policies that help people as opposed to hurt people? What are the policies that are in place? As we think about, one of the things that we talked about, within our own government, that, how do we make policy changes? And it doesn't matter who's in office. No one is perfect, but how do we come together and change policies that help everybody, that brings us all together and unites us as opposed to dividing us? One of the things that we talked about a little bit earlier is that this is not, this is a humanity issue, not a political issue. So for us to really think about, how do we help each other, that we're all in this together, and how do we have those conversations? What are the things in place right now that help us to truly have constructive conversations? And are we willing to be in those tough spots? And I think, like right now, I'm looking at the picture of Dr. Robert Canada, and I think about courageous conversations. Are we really willing to have those courageous conversations, those tough conversations that put us in uncomfortable places, but help us to learn and grow and help us to be a part of who each other is? And that's not just on our campus, but that's around the world. How do we get ourselves knowledge, as well as really truly knowing and hearing what the needs are around us? How are we a part of that? I think those are great questions to ask ourselves and those around us to be able to have those conversations.
Dr. Michie?
Okay. Well, earlier Cindy mentioned this important concept of a shared humanity, and I think we've kind of been echoing that. And I think we have to begin educating ourselves on the basis of that. That should be the place where we start. And probably a lot of you have heard this African word Ubuntu, which is basically the shared humanity. I think Desmond Tutu described it in this way: if my life can't go well, if your life isn't going well. And I think that we have to start there, and then we turn those numbers that we keep hearing about immigration into human beings, and we find that connection in our education. I mean, that's where education has to start. As Ghislaine said, many students here on campus have stories to tell us on immigration and displacement, and that's a great resource, I think, that we should feel that we benefit from, that we should encourage if people want to talk about it. And I think that we should have this should be built into our curriculum, that this should be a solid and responsible approach built into our curriculum. And that approach should, one of the things that should be kind of combating is fear, that we have to replace fear with understanding and responsibility, and stop presenting immigration as some kind of overwhelming problem that needs an immediate and dramatic fix that involves targeting people as a result. I lived in South Africa just when apartheid was ending, and I noticed that, out of fear, the white population was building all kinds of barriers and around their houses and neighborhoods, and creating elaborate, it was like fortresses, basically. They were barricading themselves in their houses, basically to keep out this danger of other people. And you have to ask yourself, what kind of life is that? What kind of life are you living behind iron gates and barbed wire and, constantly being afraid of another group of people? And I think that's often what our countries start to look at to a certain degree in the approach to immigration. So I think we have to work as a community, as a university, as a society, towards a more sensible and humane solution. And I think as a university, we have that kind of, we're particularly, we have that advantage of the brain power, to find solutions to this problem. I mean, we're constantly in our society finding ways to travel in space and create artificial intelligence and, direct all this energy towards new technologies. So I don't see why we can't use that same brain power and direct that energy towards solutions to this problem. Okay, I'll stop there.
All right. Okay. So, Ghislaine or Cindy, if you had anything to add after you've all gone now. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next question. Okay. So question number 3, what are the responsibilities of the individual? Where do you start? How can you get involved?
Well, I would say the first place we're going to start is that we're all going to go see the exhibit and spend some time reflecting on the photos and the artwork. And then I think you think of the spaces in the community where you can get involved. If you are so moved by the artwork, right? How can we get involved on our campus? So what's Cindy doing? What is OEI doing? Where are spaces that I feel I can go lend my voice, my resources to ensure that we're working towards having a more equitable community on campus and off campus. I think there's always space. There's always space for help, and a lot of the resources that I'm sure Cindy's going to talk about, the biggest resource that they're always missing is human resources, right? They never have enough people to come help with the projects or the communities that they're working in. And so where can I add my labor or my voice if I don't have time for the labor?
I think you stole some of my thunder.
I'm sorry, Cindy.
You're great. But it's true. I mean, we're all in a place that we do need to work better together, to know what those resources are that are out there, to know, like, for example, I was in a conversation on Saturday with a group of stakeholders in Lynchburg, and I told them, when I was a school counselor, I never asked students, what do you want to be? I asked them, what kind of problem do you want to solve? Because in front of us, there are problems in front of us every day. And do we really have our eyes open to what they are? Are we really aware of the issues around us, and how can we be a part of those solutions? So as I think about this question even more too, and our own individual responsibility is for us being aware, like you said, for us right now is to be a part of this exhibit in some kind of way. Really, don't just go and look at each piece. Really take in what each of those pieces are saying. Take in the humanity of each person and each place of each of those pieces. And those are places where we start. We start by gaining knowledge, by having a better understanding. And we start by voting. We're in that season right now, and we're encouraging our students to do that. That sometimes when you feel like you don't have a voice, that's a way to be empowered, to be able to make changes in your communities and in your world, is by using that responsibility, and to be responsible citizens, for us to be aware of the issues around us and be a part of those solutions, and not just sit back and watch everybody else do the work. That there are ways that we can get involved and seek those ways where you're skilled and where you're passionate about, to be able to help solve those issues of our community and the world.
Okay, so I would, of course, repeat everything that Cindy and Ghislaine said, especially about going to see the exhibit. I think if you look at it in terms of not, oh, this is so sad, but oh, what part could I play in, helping with the solution? I think that's a more positive way of looking at it. And I think that's one of the things you have to start with, is to stop seeing the immigration, what's going on with immigrants, to stop seeing them as a drain on our resources and start seeing them as making valuable contributions to our society. I think there's a very practical side to integrating people into a community that we should spend more time exploring. I think it's not that it just makes moral sense, it's just practical. And I think as individuals, I say this more to myself than anybody else, but I think learning a foreign language, I'm trying to learn two very, very slowly, very badly, but I think learning a foreign language is very helpful. And getting involved with organizations that focus on this issue. There's some really good ones. There's the International Rescue Committee. I wrote some of these down. United We Dream is a youth-led organization, over 100,000 immigrants and youths that are sort of working specifically on immigration and helping each other out. Welcoming America is another one. This is takes a really super hyper local approach to providing resources. And then there's the Immigration Advocates Nonprofit Resource Center, but there's a whole ton of them. And there's just like the ones, like Amnesty International. And it really isn't that time consuming to get involved with one of these organizations. It doesn't take as much time as you think, and it's very rewarding. But I think also just expanding your circle of friends to encompass more people from different cultures and not see that as work. It's not work, it's fantastic. Your life becomes a whole lot richer and bigger when you have people from different cultures in them. And so I think, we're living in a time of increased political and social engagement, I think, for whatever reason. And so I think there's a lot of energy out there for getting involved in these kinds of issues. Okay.
Thank you all. So those are our base questions. We've got about 15 minutes left for questions from attendees, and we'll start with some that were submitted through the registration process. So the first one being how to deal with a non-supporting government and occasionally actually an aggressive government as well. So, when getting involved, how do you navigate with that?
Well, I think we're learning that whether it's immigration or today, I think it's Black people don't want to work. We're constantly pushing up against misinformation, right? And so I think a big key to this is going to be, how do we push back against that? So how do we make sure that we have our stats or facts or figures or stories all lined up to make sure that we are trying to combat some of that misinformation? I think you realize that you have an incredible part to play in your democracy. And so if we don't like the information, or if we don't like the way a particular government supports a cause, it is within our purview to get rid of that government, right? And so how are we championing those causes? And obviously this is a lot of work, right? So it's one person at a time that you're constantly trying to change narratives if they believe the narratives of the day. And I think what Lindsay says, it's really important. If you focus on the humanity of immigrants in the country, then you'll see that it's not about Mexicans coming in to rape and kill people, or it's not about people being a drain on resources. I mean, the data will show you that immigrants pay a lot more taxes, right? And I think a lot of the narratives that we're seeing now equates immigrants with undocumented workers, and that's not the case at all, right? And so how do we battle or distinguish the narratives from the prevailing narratives from the truth? It can be really difficult to figure out what's true and what's not. And I think, as academics, we spend a lot of time reading, and me in particular, I spend a lot of time consuming news. And what I will always tell my students is that you have to read a variety of sources, and then you come to your own consensus. I promise you, the truth is somewhere in the middle, but you cannot just focus on consuming information that's palatable to you, or consuming information from news sources that you advocate for. You've got to make sure that you're reading what all the narratives are. and then you have to read a lot of boring documents. There are a lot of there's a lot of data out there that's just not as sexy as turning on Fox or turning on MSNBC at the end of the day. And I think when you consume those documents, you realize that, oh my gosh, one, immigration's been really good for the country, and I'm not just saying that because I'm an immigrant. I think if you think of the value that the stories have added, if you think about the value that that you're adding to families, because you're not just supporting families here in the States, but you're supporting a global community in many ways. And so I think we definitely have to be very careful with the information that we're consuming. And I think that's one way that we could definitely push back against non-supporting governments.
Cindy or Lindsay, do you have any response to that question?
I don't know that I could articulate as well as Dr. Lewis just did. I think the only thing that I would add to that too is be active in your government. Send letters to your representatives when you see they're doing things that you don't agree with, or and actually write to them when they do things you do agree with, so that they know that they have your support too. I think being a part of the democratic process is so important in our nation. A lot of nations don't have what we have, and for us to be, we take that for granted. So I think it's important for us to be a part of that process too.
I agree with both Cindy and Ghislaine, and I would just add that getting involved in issues like this can often lead to a lot of discouragement. And so it's important to just sort of find the thing that you really are passionate about and just keep plugging away at it, knowing that there's going to be setbacks, and that that you're often dealing with people far more powerful than you are. And so you have to figure out ways to find some leverage or convince them. And I think another thing is, I find that I often convince people better, not by arguing my point passionately, but by them seeing what I do, and if they like and respect me, they seem to notice more, the things that I'm doing than all the wonderful, eloquent arguments that I'm trying to convince them with.
Okay, thank you. We had a question in the Q&A that kind of goes off of that. So how do you distinguish misinformation from correct information? It can be hard to know who to believe in such a globalized world where there are hundreds of different sides.
So I think I kind of answered this a little bit. Yes? No? Do I need to elaborate more?
I think a little bit. So I think what I got from your answer that would maybe particularly lend itself to this question is just reading as much as you can.
I think you have to consume information voraciously, right? I think there, in my Com 101 class, I always tell students to fact check, right? You always have to fact check whatever it is you yeah, okay. Well, you always have to fact check whatever it is you're consuming. Like, you can never just trust the first source, which is why I always tell them when they're reporting their stories, even though I require 3 sources, I need you to speak to at least 6 people so that you know that the stories you're getting, the stories that you're going to ask me to publish are the actual truth, right? And so just the same way, I think you cannot just trust the first source you see. Right. And this is not me telling you to distrust journalists. I'm just telling you to be very careful with the information that you're consuming.
Thank you. Our next question from Teresa Gunter. Besides the amazing aesthetics of the exhibition, it's incredibly moving from a human point of view. Do images like these have the potential to widen the divide between Americans and refugees or immigrants because they portray refugees as the other or put Americans in the position of savior?
I guess for some people, it's always going to be an othering, right? Because that's the way you've been mentally thought to think about refugees and immigrants. But for me, I definitely see these photos as trying to highlight some of the situations that the refugees and immigrants come to this country from, right? I think immigrants and refugees always get a bad name, but let's try to understand the situations that they're trying to escape or that they're trying to flee. And I think a lot of these stories don't get told, right? For some of us on the call, we don't remember Somalia, right? Or we have no clue what's happening in Haiti. I think when you've got this hyper American narrative, right? We're focusing on self instead of thinking of ourselves as global citizens. And I think photos and the quilts definitely help us to see that we are part of a massive global community, right? And so what can we do to make sure that we are participating in that global citizenry, right? And at least for me, I think the photos definitely help you think about, oh my gosh, so far away from home, but still so close, because people are coming in with these traumas. They're coming in with these memories, right? And so how are we helping them? How are we helping them assimilate? And how are we listening? Because believe it or not, some of the countries I've been to, I've gone to those countries because people have told me stories about those countries, right? So these are amazing stories. I love these people. I want to go experience this life, this food, this culture. And so how it is that we can find ourselves as parts of a community rather than thinking of us against them.
Cindy or Lindsay?
I think these are such great conversations just to be had. Like Ghislaine just said about listening, we need to be better listeners. That oftentimes that we listen so that we can say something, so that we can contribute. But there are there's lots of times that we need to listen to understand and give people the power for their own change as well. That, I think part of that question was how do we get out of the place as seeing United States citizens as saviors. We can't fix ourselves either, that it takes all of us working together to fix the things that are broken around us and in our world. We need to have a better understanding of where people are coming from and to really be able to listen and to hear them, to know what are the best ways to solve some of those problems too.
I would just add that that question is a good argument for expanding your connections to different cultures, because the more connected you are in whatever ways, the more connected you feel to those images. They don't seem strange to you. They don't seem foreign to you. They just seem like an extension of your circle, basically. And so then you see them as people. And then if you see them as your circle, ordinarily you don't want to save everybody in your circle. You don't want to be their savior. You just want to have that relationship with them that means you help them when necessary, or you do what you can, or you care about what happens to them. So I think that's how I would see the answer, Teresa. Hope that helps.
All right, thank you all. If anybody has any other questions, you can go ahead and submit them in the Q&A. We're kind of wrapping up on time. So I'll just mention now if there are further questions that you have after Teresa, you're playing devil's advocate. If there are any other questions after this program, please feel free to email me at cole_l@lynchburg.edu, and I will pass your question along to our panelists and try to get back in touch with you. If you're interested in getting involved, Cindy, I'm sure they can reach out to you and to the Center for Community Engagement. And to also kind of look at those resources that Dr. Michie mentioned for, maybe the broader Virginia or state or a national level to get involved with different organizations as well. And again, I hope you will all come check out the exhibit that is on view through November 20th. And I hope you all—
Laura, I think there's one more question.
Yes. Is this? Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see that. How can I get connected with immigrants or refugees at our school? That's a great question.
So I would say, Stacy, that the best place would be to talk to international education first. Ellen Thompson is probably your best contact with the international community on campus. And then if there are additional questions, she can definitely point you in the direction that you need to go.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone so much for coming, and thank you, all three of you, our wonderful panelists, for speaking with us tonight. I hope that you all got as much out of this as our listeners, and I hope that we'll be able to work with you all in the future. And thank you all again. Have a great night.